Good evening. I will speak about some very controversial things. I will make two wild statements. But before I get there, let me just quickly summarize that the mainstream notion is that Jesus was a Jew. So when he walked on this earth, he was a first century Jew who became the Jewish Messiah. And his followers, once upon believing on him, they left everything behind and they became Christians. Now, I can say that these two statements are factually wrong. Jesus was not a Jew and his disciples were not Christians. Now I know this sounds rather weird and strange to some people, so let me dig into it and prove it, and more importantly to see why it is important for us to get the terminology right. So the title is Jesus and his disciples, not Jewish and not Christian. Let me dive into it. First, let's examine what Jewishness is in the Old Testament, and specifically the word Jew or Jews, what that meant. Now, this is the list of the books of the Hebrew Bible. This will agree with any Protestant Bible. So this is the Jewish canon that includes all these books. Now, we got used to the idea that the Old Testament, what we call the Old Testament, the Jews call, of course, the Bible, that's their Tanakh, that's their writings, and that includes everything to do with the history of the Jewish nation, their relationship to God, and generally everything to do with God's covenant and them. Now, yes, there is nothing wrong with this statement. However, if we look into the word Jew or Jews or Jewish or any shape or form, this phrase, in the Jewish Bible, okay, in our Old Testament, this phrase only appears 57 times. Now we could say, okay, 57 is quite a lot. What is more surprising, it only appears in 3 books: Ezra, Esther, and Daniel. Now we might have a little hiccup on this. Why? How come? Now it probably helps to understand the story if we organize the books of the Old Testament in chronological order, so the way they were written. So let's build a little timeline and organize the books in chronological order as they were written. So vast majority of scholars agree that this is how they were. So Genesis and Job started up the story, and then shortly after these books, and then Joshua and Judges and Ruth, and then basically these books were written in the same time period, and then these ones and these ones, and these were overlapping with each other, often referring to each other. So there's not much debate about the chronology of this of the Hebrew Bible. Now after these books came a block of Ezekiel, Ezra, Esther, and Daniel, and then some of the final minor prophets, Nehemiah, Haggai, Zechariah, and Malachi. So after Malachi, the Hebrew scriptures were all over. So that's it. This is the end of the revelation. Now, we can notice that when I refer to the word Jew in the Old Testament, there were only 3 books: Ezra, Esther, and Daniel. Now, these 3 books were written at the same period of time. This period of time, the word Jew or Jews become prominent and used in the Hebrew Bible. Now, what happened in this period of time? Well, this was the time of the Babylonian exile. So when the remaining people of Israel who lived in Judea at that time, were taken as captives by the Babylonians to Babylonia. So these were the 70 years of exile, of captivity. That's when the term pops up. The name Yehudaye, which we translate as Jew or Jewish, it literally just means from Judea. So those captives who are taken from the Judea area, they are the Jews, according to Babylonians. Now, after the exile, when the Jews were allowed to return back to their homeland, they took the name, the word, with themselves. Though they didn't seem to use it, the later books didn't use it, but nevertheless it was a known phrase. Now the Hebrew word was Yehudae. In the Greek, in the Hellenistic culture, Hellenistic time, the same word carried on with Judaioi. Okay, Judaioi. Judaioi. That was Jew, Jewish. Again, exactly the same word, just transliterated. Jew was used by those outside the nation of Israel as a term of reference from the captives from Judea. It specifically refers to the members of the 2 or 2.5 tribes, so the southern Judean tribes. Now, when I say 2.5, it means that Judah and Benjamin were the 2 tribes who were left in the southern part of the country, and half of, or majority of the Levite priests, because they served in Jerusalem, they also were included. So that's why you call it 2.5. Now, they did not call themselves Jews. Okay, never. Instead of Jew, they used other words like Hebrew or Israelite for self-identification. Sometimes the people of the land of Israel or the people of Judah or similar terms. Both before and after the Babylonian captivity, these words were the ones they used for self-identification. Furthermore, something else happened. During the period of the Second Temple in Jerusalem, Israelite religious practice was transformed. So let's remember, this is the time when the people returned to Judea, to Jerusalem, rebuild the city, rebuild the temple. Yet their national identity or the national consciousness got really damaged because they lost 10 tribes. Israel wasn't complete. They only had the 2 tribes plus the Levites left. But they focused on their religious practice, so they reinstalled the sacrifice, reinstalled all the rituals. And this also distinguished them from who they really looked down upon is the Samaritans. Samaritans were those Israelites with Israelite blood in them who believed in the Torah, yet they mixed with other nations. So they were unclean. They were hybrid. They were not somebody to talk to, according to the Jews. Now remember, this Jew, the word Jew, they brought this word with them from Babylonia, and it had a negative connotation. So it was not a self-identifying word. And there was this political elite and religious elite emerging, who we read a lot about later as the Pharisees and the Sadducees. And these became the members of this leading religious group, who now the people started to refer with this negative phrase as Jew, the religious people, the class, and they were the Jews. So in the mouth of the common people, the word Jew no longer meant the Israelite or Judean people, but pointed at the religious leaders and their inner circles. Now we'll see this actually in the New Testament to carry on. So let's recap the use of the word Jew. So we have the outside nations. Okay, so we've got the outside nations, and within that we have Israel or the Israelites. Okay, and within the Israelites we saw this religious elite emerging. Now the outsiders referred to the Israelites as Jews. The Israelites themselves, amongst themselves didn't, but when they had correspondence or communication, contact with outside people, they also referred to themselves as Jews because they knew that was the phrase the outsiders understood. Okay, so the Jews was an outsider term. Plus, the Israelites themselves referred to this religious elite, the class, as the Jews. Now, how did it carry on into the New Testament? So let's say Jewishness in the New Testament. So we discussed the Greek word is Judaioi. Judaioi. This phrase appears 196 times in the New Testament, and I've got a list of the books here and how many times they appear. We can see that most of the books of the New Testament uses this word, Jew. However, it may seem odd that one very important book is missing, is not using the word Jew. Guess what book it is? Hebrews. Exactly, the book about Jews or to Jews. It doesn't have the word Jew in it. How strange. Let's see why. It's useful to look at who uses the word Jew and how. I have 3 claims here, 3 sentences. And let's see if these stand the test. So I say the reference to the Israelite people from the perspective of outsiders. So that's why one way the word Jew is used. So outsiders. Number two, religious leaders or their particular beliefs, which is usually very strict or very following the law by the letter. Or the third option is Israelites may refer to themselves as Jews when communicate with outsiders, but never among themselves. So that's what I'm saying is exactly what I demonstrated with those three circles and how the interaction of the words were. Let's see if this stands the test. Okay, these three. Matthew's Gospel has the word Jew 6 times in it. Each time agrees with this. Okay, you can read it. You can pause it and read it if you want. I don't want to spend too much time on each slide. Mark, same thing, 6 times. Again, every time it was the word Jew was phrased by somebody outside of the Jews, typically the Romans. And once actually it says the Pharisees and all the Jews who do not eat unless they carefully wash their hands. Those, yeah, again, the religious people. Luke, only 4 times appear. Let's see, Jewish elders. Now it says, now when they heard about Jesus, he sent some Jewish elders. Okay, so the Jews and the Jesus were a separate category, not intermixing. Again, Romans. And a man of Armitaria, the city of the Jews, who were waiting for a king. Okay, by the way, Luke, just to mention, Luke was himself a Gentile, Greek. Okay, so he can actually refer to Jews as Jews. Now we are after the last gospel, John. Now John uses the word Jew or Jews 66 times. There's a lot. I'm not going to put all the references up. I went through all of them. They all fit into my categories. There is one which I might want to point out, which is when Jesus speaks to the Samaritan woman. And Jesus himself says, you worship what you do not know. We worship what we know. For salvation is from the Jews. So we could say, oh, so Jesus identifies as Jew. No, not really. He's not self-identifying. Again, he's speaking to an outsider, to a Samaritan who is considered unclean. Okay, so, and she, by the way, she started to use the word Jew first. So Jesus is using her language, her terminology. It doesn't mean that Jesus speaks about himself amongst Israelites as Jew. Now we went through all the 66 books of John and 66 references of Jew, and they fit. Now the rest of the Acts of the Apostles is an interesting one, 81 references. Again, Acts of the Apostles were written by Luke, a Greek, so he's an outsider. Yet he still, so he basically uses Jew the way many people do today, the way we kind of feel or hear it today. It usually refers to the religious people or the followers of the religion we now call Judaism. However, we need to remember that Judaism as such didn't exist. There was not a homogeneous belief system. There was basically a wide variety of beliefs within the Israelites. Okay, so Judaism wasn't the thing. And remember that Luke himself was a Greek doctor, not an Israelite. This is consistent with the fact that Gentiles refer to them as Jews. Now we've got Paul's letters. Paul the Apostle is very consistent in his letters regarding the use of these phrases. Watch. When he is speaking to Gentiles, so Romans or Greeks, he often calls the Israelite Jews. Yeah, Israelites Jews. So when he speaks to outsiders. However, when he's writing about himself, he uses words like Hebrew or Israelite. You can check, that's how it works. So Romans 1, Romans 3, Romans 2. When he speaks to outsiders, it says salvation everyone believes to the Jew first, that both Jews and Greeks are all under sin. Or is God the God of Jews only? He's not. So when he's evangelizing Gentiles, he refers to his people as Jews. However, look at this. Are they Hebrews? So am I. Are they Israelites? So am I. And so on. In Philippians, he says, circumcised on the 8th day, the nation of Israel, of the tribe of Benjamin, Hebrew of Hebrews, as to the law, a Pharisee. Interesting. So about himself, he does not use the word Jew. The last book of the Bible, Revelation, only uses the word Jew twice. At both occasions, it's a negative message, describing some people who are puffed up by their religion and actively attacking or against the Christ-believing church. At both cases, they are called to be the synagogue of Satan. We see this pattern in the whole New Testament. In conversations with outsiders, Jew is used, but in self-identification is always Israelite, Hebrew, sons of Israel, house of Israel, or something similar. But let's ask, what about Jesus? How was he identified in terms of ethnicity or national belonging? The New Testament consistently identifies Jesus with family relations, such as son of Joseph and Mary, or geographical origins like the Nazarene or of Nazareth or the Galilean, never as a Jew. Now this family relation or geographical origin is actually very typical of ancient cultures everywhere. When Jesus is mentioned as a Jew or Judean, it's always spoken by outsiders. So for example, the Romans, or if you remember the Magi from the East, when they came and they said, we saw the sign of the King of the Jews. Right? So outsiders still use this phrase, but never Israelites for themselves. Now the narratives about the trial and crucifixion of Jesus is very consistent again. If you read them carefully, it distinguishes between insider and outsider language. So outsiders used Jew, but never his disciples, his family, or anybody who knew him. Now this is a scene when Jesus was taken to Pontius Pilate for judgment. Pilate had the right to decide if Jesus is going to live or die. Now there's an interesting observation about the usage. Matthew 27, Mark 15 and Luke 23 tell us the same story. So it says that when Jesus stood before the governor and the governor questioned him saying, "Are you the king of the Jews?" And Jesus said to him, "You yourself say it." Remember this translation. And the other one, and answering again, Pilate was saying to them, "Then what shall I do with him who call the king of the Jews?" King of the Jews. Pilate asked him, "Are you the king of the Jews?" He answered him and said, "You yourself say it." So you yourself say it. Now all three cases, all three records say actually the same thing. And when Jesus says, "You said," this is the sulegeis, okay, in Greek. You said. It's a very simple two words. It's usually interpreted as a kind of passive approval, almost cynical, like a ironic, "Oh, you say so." But I don't think Jesus needed to have any sarcasm in the whole thing when he talked with Pilate. In my opinion, it's much better to see that way or interpret this way, that Jesus is "you said" is like "you say it like that," or Pilate says, "Are you the king of the Jews?" Well, as you say it. So you would use these words, but basically means I wouldn't. So Jesus agrees with Pilate who he is, but he wouldn't use this word. You say it like this, the king of the Jews. And I don't think I'm just reading it into the story, because Pilate's reaction later reveals that it seems to be the case. Let's read John 19. There they crucified him, and with him 2 other men, one on either side, and Jesus in between. And Pilate also wrote an inscription and put it on the cross. It was written, "Jesus the Nazarene, the King of the Jews." Or in another translation, "Jesus of Nazareth, the King of the Jews." Therefore, many of the Jews read this inscription. Many of the Jews. Remember, this was a Jewish festival of Passover. Jews from all the nations, actually, whoever could afford, went to Jerusalem for this celebration. Certainly locals were all there. For the place where Jesus was crucified was near the city. The place was the hill of Golgotha, and it was just outside Jerusalem. And it was written, this inscription was written in Hebrew, Latin, and in Greek. In Hebrew it sounds as Yeshua HaNozri Melech HaYehudim. You could not misunderstand it if you were a religious Jew, because Hebrew was still spoken and used as a language. Latin was widely spoken, especially by, think about it, there was lots of Roman presence, Roman soldiers. They spoke Latin, that was their official language. So Pilate wrote it in Latin as well. And in Greek, which was the language everybody spoke. So if you didn't speak Hebrew, Latin, or Greek, you just weren't there. And this sentence was hard to miss. So there was a clear sign above Jesus' head with these words in every language. Now, this became an issue for the Jewish leaders. Let's see what happens. So the chief priest of the Jews, were saying to Pilate, "Do not write the King of the Jews," but he said, "I am the King of the Jews." Pilate answered, "What I have written, I have written." Now, look the sneakiness of the Jewish priests. They say, "The King of the Jews," we don't like this, because they are the Jews. And they don't like this idea that he is their king. So instead, say what he said, that I am the King of the Jews. Note, Jesus never said this. He actually never said these words, but they wanted Pilate to change the writing. Now, Pontius Pilate wasn't that stupid. He answered, "What I have written, I have written." So it seems like Pilate understood Jesus' coded message. You remember when Jesus said to him, when Pilate asked him, "Are you the King of the Jews?" Jesus didn't repeat saying, "I am the King of the Jews." No, he said, "That's how you say it." So Pontius Pilate wrote exactly what he thought, what was his conviction. So he deliberately does not please the Jews, allegedly quoting Jesus. You remember, he never actually said that he was king of the Jews. So Pilate rather inscribed his own view, and as he wanted to say it, which is, Jesus of Nazareth is the King of the Jews. But after this little detour about Pontius Pilate's use of the word, let's summarize. We have seen that the word Jew appeared after and during the Babylonian captivity. In both the Old and New Testaments, the word Israelite or Hebrew were used as a characteristic of self-identifying. The word Jew or Judean was used exclusively in connection with outsiders. The Israelites used geographical, tribal, or family identifications among themselves. Later in the New Testament, the same continued, but at the same time the word Jew had already designated a religious class who were distinct from the average Hebrew or Israelite or Judean people through their strict law-centered religious life. Remember the words Yehude and Judeoi. And just a recapping, so outside nations called the Israelite Jews. Israelites referred to themselves only when they corresponded with outsiders. And they used the Jew for the religious elite, the Jews, the priests. Now, after this discussion about the word Jew, what about the word Christian? Because that was my other statement, that the disciples weren't Christians. Let's see. The word is Christianos in Greek. And I copied here 3 mentions from the New Testament, 3 verses. The reason I put exactly these 3 verses is because only these 3 verses say the word Christian in the New Testament. Jesus and his followers were not Christians. Okay, they were not called Christians, but members of the nation of Israel, or the house of Israel. Now this is a huge difference, since we are not talking about a new religion, but rather an expansion or a redefinition of the Israel of God, what Israel really means. So the first disciples of Jesus were Israelites who now believe in Jesus as the Messiah. They didn't become Christians. Jesus himself, of course, was never called a Christian during his lifetime, which wouldn't make sense anyway, because the term didn't exist, and he can't be Christ-like if he is the Christ. So obviously Jesus was never called. Now his followers identified themselves always as Galileans, Nazarenes, or the followers or the preachers of the way, never as Jews or Christians. Interesting. So we already discussed that Jew wasn't a thing for self-identification, nor was Christians. They never called themselves Christians. The term Christian was later used by outsiders, most often as a pejorative or the derogatory term, similar to Jew actually. Okay, let's have a look. So the identification of Jesus and his disciples after his resurrection. So what happened after Jesus was resurrected? In Luke 24. And they said to him, the things about Jesus the Nazarene, who was a mighty prophet indeed and word in the sight of God and all the people. So that's how his disciples refer to him, Jesus of Nazareth. Acts 22. Now this is interesting. Paul addresses his fellow men of Israel. Remember, again, he's not using the word Jew. He's a Jew. They are Jews, so he's not using the word Jew. He says, men of Israel, listen to these words. And now comes Jesus. Jesus the Nazarene. Okay. Acts 4. Let it be known to all of you and to all the people of Israel. So it doesn't say, and to all the Jews, that there is a Jewish Messiah. Never says that. To all the people of Israel, that by the name of Jesus Christ the Nazarene, Christ means the Messiah, okay, the anointed, Jesus Christ the Nazarene, or of Nazareth, whom you crucified, whom God raised from the dead, and so on. Now, in Acts 25, there is a self-identification as Jew. Now, this is very interesting. Acts 24. For we have found this man a real pest and a fellow who stirs up dissension among all the Jews throughout the world, and the ringleader of the sect of the Nazarenes. Sect of the Nazarenes. These are what we think are Christians, yeah? But the sect of the Nazarenes. But who is talking? Let's see who is speaking. The we self-identifying as Jew, it actually tells us in the previous passage, is the high priest Ananias, some elders, and an attorney named Tertullus. So he again refers to the religious class. Okay, and he thinks everybody else is, like them, or the other Israelites like them. So he refers to the Israelite nation like stirs of dissension among all the Jews, all the good, religious, pious people throughout the world. Oh, this ringleader of the sect of the Nazarenes. Okay, so it's again a religious class talk, and Jesus is identified as a Nazarene. Or the disciples even called the sect of the Nazarenes. When Jesus appeared to Saul, who later became Paul the Apostle, appears to Saul, this is how he introduces himself, Acts 22. But it happened that I was, okay, this is Saul or Paul telling the story. But it happened that as I was on my way approaching Damascus about noontime, a very bright light suddenly flashed from heaven all around me, and I fell to the ground and heard a voice saying to me, Saul, Saul, why are you persecuting me? And I answered, Who are you, Lord? And he said to me, I am Jesus the Nazarene, whom you are persecuting. So again, the resurrected Jesus from heaven speaks and identifies himself with these words, I am the Jesus the Nazarene, or I am Jesus of Nazareth. Now there is a story in Acts 26 when Paul the Apostle was taken in front to King Agrippa. Now Agrippa already knows this sect as Christians. He's never met them. But this is how the outsiders were talking about them. So Agrippa already uses this phrase. Let's see what Paul the Apostle uses. I'm not going to read the whole thing. It's pretty long. Very interesting though. But pointing out a few things. What I highlighted with yellow is the word Jew is used. Paul the Apostle kind of distances himself from the religious class, the Jews. He says, I am accused by the Jews. Strange, isn't it? Because he himself was one of them, but not anymore. All customs questioning among the Jews. Accused by the Jews. The Jews seized me and tried to put me to death. Okay, so he refers to the religious class as the Jews. When he talks about himself, let's see. All Jews know my manner of life from my mouth. From the beginning was spent among my own nation and at Jerusalem. Interesting, it doesn't say ever that I was a Jew. He just doesn't. He just says among my own nation and at Jerusalem. Though, what else could it be? And it says, I'm willing to testify that I lived as a Pharisee. So I used to belong to this class, but not anymore. According to the strictest sect of our religion. Yeah, of our religion. Doesn't say Judaism or the Jews. Okay. Now standing here being tried for the hope and the promise made by God to our fathers. The promise to which our 12 tribes hope to attain. Very Israel language. And now it's with the hope of the 12 tribes, even though 10 are missing. And it goes on. I'm being accused by the Jews. So the name of Jesus the Nazarene. So that's how he refers to Jesus. Neither says the Jewish Messiah, the Jesus of Nazarene. And this is what I did in Jerusalem. Not only did I lock up many of the saints in prison, and goes on. Saints, that's how it refers to the believers. It doesn't say Christians, the saints. And let's see. Right, both our people instead of Jews, he says our people, and to the Gentiles. And then Agrippa uses the word, in such short time, are you persuading me to become a Christian? So Agrippa replied this. Okay, so only Agrippa is using this phrase Christian. Paul never does. So the third mention and last mention of the word Christian is in 1 Peter 4. Now, Peter is talking to the local Christians and encourages them to carry on, to accept the sufferings, which is basically by this they partake in the sufferings of Christ. And in his letter he says the following: if you are insulted for the name of Christ, you are blessed. So insult. So he talks about some insults here. Make sure none of you suffers as a murderer or thief or evildoer or a troublesome meddler. But if anyone suffers as a Christian, he is not to be put to shame. So don't be ashamed. Okay, but is to glorify God in this name. So this title, Christian, was part of people insulting them. But Peter is encouraging the believers, don't worry about it, accept it, take it with pride, take it with yeah, you are glorifying God by doing this. We have observed that the word Christian wasn't a label that was taken on voluntarily and by their own decision, but it was rather a derogatory term, a pejorative title attached to them by outsiders. Jesus' first century followers were encouraged to suffer it gladly, because by this they are accepting the sufferings that glorifies the name of Jesus. The Jesus movement as such, so the new faith, this new way, this came to Israel and to the whole world. Okay, not to the Jews, to Israel. And it came as a messianic renewal, not as some new Jewish or Christian religion. The early churches did not call the path to be followed Christianity either. So they didn't call it Christianity until about the 3rd or 4th century. But rather it was called the way, or just simply the faith, or the universal church, meaning the Catholic Church. That's what the word meant. Okay, so they became suddenly Christianity, or they didn't become the Christian religion. They just became the church, the ecclesia, the gathering of the believers. Okay. And because of all this, in my opinion, we should only call it Christianity from the time when the state church was formed, and they actually called themselves Christians, which is the earliest possible mention was Tertullian. But even Tertullian in AD 197, he didn't really identify a religion as such. He put it in contrast with the faith of the Jews at that time, the Jewishness, and he put it in contrast to them, the Christians, okay, the Christ-likes. But it's not something that they themselves refer to. Okay, much later, I would say it's better to even leave it for later, probably the time of Constantine, when it really became a state religion, and Christianity as such became an entity on its own right. And it's very debatable if it's good or bad, but at least it existed as Christianity. So we arrived to my closing statements as such. I would suggest to use the following terminology. First of all, to distinguish between Judaism and the Judean way of life or Judean culture. Judaism as such, as a homogeneous religion, only developed later, much later. At this time, the Israelite faith had multiple facets. There were various different schools of thought, different sects, different denominational teachings. So Judaism as such didn't exist yet. So when we say things like, oh, the Jews believed in this, the Jews believed in that, well, some might. But if you want to talk about the Israelites, or when you say Jewish custom, well, depends what you mean. I think it would be much better to use the Judean way of life, or Judean culture at that time was so and so, such and such. Okay, so let's first of all distinguish. Now, instead of Jew, first of all, Jew, we can use the word Jew in one particular case, which is where we are already talking about insiders of the religious ruling class in Jerusalem at that time. So talk about the priests, the Pharisees, the Sadducees, and the members of the Sanhedrin. So these were the Jews. So we talk about their people or their faith or their statements, yeah, we can say the Jews. But when we talk about, generally speaking, the people, we should use the word Israelite or Hebrew or Hebrews, or something like the house of Israel, or the nation or people of Israel. These are all biblical correct phrases to use, which is not the same as Jew. Okay, so I think we should use these phrases. It could deal actually itself with a lot of anti-Semitism. For example, we wouldn't see as, oh, the Jews crucified Jesus as a global collective. No, they didn't. Lots of them actually welcomed him, Hosanna, the son of David. Okay. The religious Jews made the decision, yes. The others might, obey them or just put, their head down and just get on with it. But generally speaking, when you read Jew from the early period of time, 1st century and around there, it refers to the Jewish leading class. Okay, so we should use the word Israelite or Hebrew, or the house of Israel, nation or people of Israel. Yeah. What about the Christianity terminology? So the first followers of Jesus were all Israelites. They were Nazarenes, as we read, the Nazarene sect. They were Galileans. Okay, now which one you use, it depends which one is correct, because not everybody had to come from Galilee. Okay, but we could all say they were Nazarenes. They were Israelites who followed Jesus, disciples of Jesus, Israelites. Okay, so this is talking about the people there and then, the followers of Jesus. So they weren't Christians. Now the early disciples, from this onwards, for at least a few hundred years, they didn't identify as Christians. What they used instead is disciple. Why not just simply disciple of Jesus? Believers, they were the believers. Saints, very often referred to as the saints, fellowship of the saints. That's a very nice, good phrase to use, because we are sanctified in Christ and we are called his saints. Okay, so there's nothing wrong with calling ourselves the saints. They were referred to as brothers and sisters. Very simple, very good. Often they were called a follower of the way or followers of the way. Sometimes the proclaimers of the way. Sometimes a combination of follower of the way of the Lord. Okay, something on the lines of follower of the way being Jesus. Didn't he say, I am the way? Yep, you are followers of the way. Or another very simple one, servant of Christ, servant of the Christ. So try to get this into our heads. Israelite Hebrew for instead of Jew. Disciple, believer, saint, brothers, sisters, follower of the way, servant of Christ instead of Christian. So this is my response when I hear that Jesus was the Jewish Messiah who started Christianity. No, he was not Jewish, and no, they weren't Christians. Yes, he was the Messiah for everyone. He came to the house of Israel. He was a Judean, Israelite, when he walked on earth. Now he's the Messiah for all. And we are his disciples. We are the, if you like, the sect of the Nazarenes. Okay, we are not Christians. We can be called Christians, but the messy religiousness of Judaism and Christianity, I think we're better off keep away from it and stick to be the followers of the way, Jesus Christ.